welcome to another episode of Money for Nothing, the podcast about music and capitalism. I'm Saxon with Sam Becker as always. Sad news, RIP to music journalism.
Yeah, it was.
Okay, not really, but
it was fine while it lasted.
yeah, it was good. Yeah. No, news came last week that Pitchfork, the music criticism heavyweight, will be merged with the men's magazine GQ, also known as Gentleman's Quarterly, leading to layoffs. I think like half its staff.
A lot of layoffs, and a lot of of the people who had done really good job of shifting Pitchfork's culture.
Yeah. According to a memo from Anna Wintour, the chief content officer of Conde Nast, you know her. Apparently, without taking off her glasses, she basically told the Pitchfork staff that they'd be folded into GQ. It's not exactly clear what that means, but I think this news has led to, or it's clear that this news has led to a lot of lamenting about the deteriorating state of music journalism, and kind of reflects also journalism writ large, with a lot of trends this year of widespread layoffs continuing. I think actually a week after, during the same week we got the Pitchfork news, the LA Times laid off of half its staff or something.
Yeah, a big chunk. And then there was big layoffs at NPR Music recently. I mean, last year but
right.
Just kind of slashes in newsrooms across the spectrum.
Right. Yeah. And then so but in the music journalism realm, it seems particularly a ninth level of bleak. I mean, the mood on the internets was I think peak existential crisis when it came to music journalism. And obviously we're going to dive into all that and what was behind the changes to Pitchfork and what it reflects, not only the trends in music journalism we've seen, but also the music industry and the digital media itself. But I think it's probably good to just take a moment and sort of lament over Pitchfork ourselves. I mean, on this podcast, we've obviously interviewed numerous Pitchfork writers and contributors. I've worked with and known various folks who were now past tense part of Pitchfork. And obviously it's pretty bleak. A lot of talented writers out there doing cool shit who are going to have to turn to the freelance hustle game, which is already there's a shrinking pool of positions for music journalism and really cultural writing and where you can write and actually make a living. So yeah, it's rough. And I mean, on a personal level, it's just a little strange because I mean, I feel like Pitchfork was such a major piece of the puzzle when it comes to I guess the community of obsessive music fans that I've surrounded myself with. I mean, it seems to always come up in conversation when you're talking about something. I mean, whether it's complaining about it or praising it, regardless, it was part of it. Sort of was a part of the conversation that makes this sort of, whatever you want to call it, music nerd community. And yeah, it's very strange that it's.
I mean, it was an institution, and I think that a lot of people
a newer
had
institution that we kind of saw develop in the last 20 years. It's we saw it become what it was, so it's kind of cool.
Yeah. No, and I think there's a lot of times people would complain about Pitchfork a lot, but it was there in a solid, stable way as a major music publication. And I mean, this has been talked about to death, but in the US at least, there were clearly big music publications of previous eras. Rolling Stone and Cream in the 60s and 70s, things like The Source and XXL and Spin in the 90s, and early 2000s maybe, clearly the much bemoaned death of various indie papers, city papers. I mean, I was a particularly big fan of the Boston Phoenix, which I thought was just a fabulous set of record reviewers. Similarly, the Village Voice, the Onion AV Club, which was
Onion
AV Club, of the
super fun
of the journalistic institutions that really shaped my thinking and critical perspective on music. The Onion AV Club was probably the biggest one for me, actually.
One of my first credits, actually, my first ever bylines.
Really?
Yeah, I did an interview profile of the I think Oregon-based folk artist Laura Veers. But anyways,
but really, I think that those were all kind of declining and on the way out. At a moment when Pitchfork was rising, and so has really been the definitive music journalism platform like of like the general millennial experience, like in ways both like incredibly stereotypical and good and bad. But like, and I think that this is just like the sense that everyone has, which is that like there's a huge difference between like you can really not like there being a major like music centered publication like that, but the sense that it could go away is just mind blowing to, I mean, totally predictable at some levels, or like it's not something that people thought was outside of the realm of possibility. But at the same time, like just because you know something could happen, like doesn't, the difference between when it does really happen. To a certain extent, it feels weirdly like Twitter, right? Where Twitter was a place that defined a certain sensibility and that everyone complained about all the time. And then when it really did finally become mostly unusable, there's this sense of like loss that even if it was like not always perfect, it was like, it was mine, not always perfect.
Well, there was always something to talk about. That's the thing about Pitchfork. Like whether or not you championed it or disagreed or were neutral, like there was always something on there to talk about. And like I don't know how much that like holds resonance anymore. But regardless, I think it's obviously like a shame to be like. Well, actually, so it's a shame to be without it. But actually, what I wanted to say actually is that it's actually not going away, which feels like even like it's a weird like worse fate in a sense. Like I guess with like Bandcamp, there's like, I mean, it's a different platform, obviously, but just to use that as an example, it's like it getting sold and there being layoffs. It like still exists and it's still operating as Bandcamp. You could still get like the weekly updates of new music. There's still some articles. Bands still have like their pages on there. And like, yes, who knows what it will become, but for now it's the same. But with Pitchfork, it's like, it's this weird, like, you're just going to become a section.
I don't think we know what's going to happen.
GQ? It's so bizarre. It's so bizarre. Yeah, it's so strange. And I mean, I guess it's like maybe how like, I guess we can assume, or we can not assume, but we can probably, it sounds like it's going to become like the way that like Noisy was to Vice maybe, but like it's TBD, but it just feels like such like a weird
RIP to another solid like music publication.
That had some canceling issues, but like feels okay. But anyways, it feels like such like a bizarre, the weird like folding into GQ feels like such, it's like I wish they would just sold it. You know what I mean? Like just sell it to someone else.
Well, I mean, and I think though that, and this is really I think what we're going to talk about here today to a certain extent, because I actually think that like that folding into GQ is really interesting, and because I also feel like looking at the kind of wave of sadness and anger and nihilism that like erupted around this Pitchfork news, like I know I was trying to think through like what I could or what we could add to that discussion that hasn't been covered quite so much, because I feel like there's a lot of like real sadness and like I said, and it's totally all legitimate. But I think that like that folding into GQ and the weirdness of it and the specificity
the hot
of
take
it
coming on
is actually really interesting. No, it's really interesting because I think that it to me raises a bunch of questions, both about like the specific structures of journalism in this moment and about like some specific questions I think about like what music journalism is for and what music criticism is for in this moment. That and I think that by like focusing in on that as like the concrete basis for like thinking about this broader situation, it's actually like really, really useful and maybe a way to like throw some instead of saying like, oh my God, the it's the end of music journalism. It's like, oh my God, music journalism. It's the end of a certain kind of music journalism, I think probably. And like what actually comes, like what it was folded into GQ, and I think that there's a there that I think I want to talk about.
Yeah. I mean, I hear what you're saying, and like I definitely have some ideas. I mean, in some ways, it even kind of like when I try to think about it more positively, or like I don't know, positively is the word, but try to thinking about it like a little bit more complexly. Like I think like one thing that came to mind was the way that like newspapers used to be structured, where they had a section, they had the sports section, they had the music and culture section, and it's like I it's hard for me to like believe that Anna Wintour and company have really any fucking clue what they're doing. And I'm sure this is very profit motivated or lack of profit motivated. But like it is one idea I did think of. I was like, well, maybe this is just going to become like almost a structure that's similar to newspaper, where there's like it's more sectional instead of like its own freestanding publication. But I don't know if GQ is the place for that. But maybe yeah. So to move on, but like I think maybe it's a good idea to kind of paint a quick dirty picture of the sort of unique story and history of Pitchfork, and how it changed along with the media landscape that eventually led to this news. Just to give a little bit of background before we dive into this, for people who maybe don't know, like, you know, Pitchfork actually it's quite like the dare I say American dream story. It like literally is like the sort of trope of the guy who starts something in like his parents' basement is actually Ryan Schreiber from Pitchfork, who actually did start Pitchfork living at his parents' house in Chicago, and like was basically a teenager. I guess it was briefly located in Minneapolis as well. But anyways, over the next like 10 to 15 years, what was basically like a music review site that kind of focused more on like indie music and like underground music, expanded its offices to Brooklyn, and it like ended up having like 50 plus employees, and they launched like a music festival. And for like a good decade and a half, it was like this very much like cool kid online like music mag that lasted for years, really completely independent, and was able to sustain like 50 plus employees, if not more. And like that's a pretty unique period, not only in sort of
right,
it's a unique story, but it also feels like this very unique period of like the internet, where like you could have people buy ads on your website instead of like the whole targeted ad bullshit.
I mean, that's the one thing though. I actually feel like, funnily enough, like it's not a unique story. I would push back on that.
No, that time period though?
No, that time period was unique. But like I would say to me it's not so much a unique story in that like this new generation comes online, millennials who are writing and blogging and using social media in different ways. And there's like a cohort of kind of edgy digital first publications explode into these markets that get big readerships that then can use advertising, budgets, and that then get really big valuations. And like, I don't know exactly like whether or not Pitchfork took on investment, but certainly I know that other sites, think about Vox, think about Vice, think about HuffPo, right? Think about the Daily Beast. No, but they're like, right, these like websites that blew up out of sometimes they've got all those sites have different histories and different levels of initial funding, but the sense of them blowing up from very small into large digital brands that were really highly valued and that were understood to be competing successfully against like the established media structures between, I'd say, 2003 and 2013. And Pitchfork was the music one.
Yeah, no, but it was an interesting like period. That's what I'm trying to say. It was a very unique period of time, which is like it's much more difficult to do that now unless you like get serious funding.
Right. Well, it's also because,
or it's under the banner of something like Substack.
Yeah, I mean, it's also because I think that this was web, and we could think about it in terms of like
this like Pitchfork essentially started in Web 1.0.
Yeah,
and
it
was part of the transition to Web 2.0.
No. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's like Pitchfork is part of the open garden, right? It's Web 1.0 structures that blows up, and I think a lot of these journalist enterprises blow up on the back of social media, but they do it just before social media starts to enclose everything, right? So this is like right before most people read the news on Facebook, don't just like link out of Facebook, right? The sense of where the profits are and where the advertising money is. And what happens over time clearly is that like to journalism writ large is that the old model which is classic newspapers starts to fall apart, and this new model doesn't remain financially sustainable, as certainly also because a lot of their the growth metrics and like the projected value of these companies was insane. And Vice is maybe the most famous example of that, where it's that they were like, Vice is going to be a media empire and it's going to be valued at billions of dollars. And then it's like they didn't turned out that like sending like drunk kids to like war zones, like the aesthetic shifted and that wasn't cool anymore. We don't like Vice would have like sent someone to Gaza and it would have been horrifying. Like 2011 Vice. And it's like, that's not good. Like the voyeuristic shit that they were putting out was like a very late 2000s irony vibe. Maybe that's a different point, but I think that just generally things shifted. The amount of valuation that these companies received was unsustainable, and the business model shifted, and advertising revenues fall across the board.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, but I think going back to this Vice thing, I think it's interesting. Just to use it as an example. It is interesting because like all these companies did act like they were going to be like the next media empire, and it was like riding that gravy train, but with like very little. I mean, and maybe this is just common, but like very little sort of look towards like the sort of nearish, far off future. Like this is just the way it's going to be always.
And they didn't.
And like
see
Vice
how things
decides
would
to buy up
change.
19
Yeah,
blocks
this is
in
how
Brooklyn and RIP Glasslands.
Just close every venue.
Thank you. And now they're probably selling all that property now. Oh, God. Anyways,
Vice,
it's a very New York complaint.
Yeah, that's true.
But
Vice came in and just purchased every single venue in Brooklyn and closed them for reasons that like no one understood at the time.
Yeah, so annoying.
But also, so like Pitchfork, I think also interesting, like was one of the more institutionalized of those, right? They have a successful music festival. They a fairly early music festival, though not one that ever got as glammed out or successful as Coachella or even Bonnaroo.
But maybe on purpose.
Probably on purpose.
Yeah.
No, but my point is just that this thing was like Pitchfork was fairly institutionalized, and my sense is that and partially I think because it was focused on music, and music has like a built-in top, maybe, right? There's a real ceiling to a publication that remained pretty much dedicated to music. I mean, there was a couple. They tried to spin out a film site. They tried to spin out a visual arts site at various points, but
news to me.
None of those ever really took. But my point being that maybe just because of the ceiling, it was never like it was not going to pitchfork the whole world, I don't think. And so it did seem like, in comparison to a lot of these other websites, which like overreached and started to crumble, and were even starting to crumble by like 2014, 2015. Like that, like things had already started to like the pivot to video had already started to like not pan out. Pitchfork was actually like relatively stable, it felt like. And so that was one of the reasons why it then got bought. And I think that when it got bought by Conde Nast, it was kind of seen as like a trade-off, right? But like as like another step towards further stability, because Conde Nast like has a series of different specifically focused and specifically targeted publications that it had been able to maintain over a long period of time while like leveraging its scale and professionalism. And so like I think it was clearly like a lose,
and it didn't have a music one.
And it didn't have a music one really. Right. And it didn't have a music one really. And so it was seen, I think, at the time that while like you lost a certain level of independence, there was a potential beneficial trade-off with the purchase by Conde Nast. And like clearly there have been problems, but you know, a lot of times we read about someone, you know, a newspaper gets bought and then gutted immediately, right? Pitchfork was bought almost a decade ago. It was bought in 2015. And so there's been a minute of this. And that's why I actually think it's useful maybe to like having like discussed both, contextualize this from the framework of all of the other music publications that really hit problems during this period. And you know, we mentioned it, but I do think like Rolling Stone changes its format a bunch of times. It almost, and maybe even brief, I don't know if it ever actually disappeared off newsstands, but like really struggled and has gone through multiple rebrands. Spins folded into online and then basically folded. NME gets purchased. A whole host of these small music publications just don't really make the transition. I mean, there's a couple of like brave holdouts, like shouts out to the Quietus, of course.
God bless the Quietus.
Consequence of Sound, Stereo Gum, those are all still going.
Stereo Gum still
those are all still going.
Yeah.
The Wire, which is like just maintains like in some ways like the
model,
and like the Conde Nast model, which is you have a thing that people can buy, it's expensive, and you maintain a subscriber base, and like it won't make a lot of money, but like it'll make some money. Yeah, so there's this absolute decimation of music journalism on these music journalism spaces, and we'll come back to that later. We've talked about kind of the decimation of traditional newsprint, the collapse, the rise and fall of these new digital millennial focused operations. So I actually think taking at this from a little angle of looking at Pitchfork from the perspective of Conde Nast and thinking about this sale, the purchase, and then also what's been happening within Conde Nast, I think is an important way to think about what's happened at Pitchfork and what's happening with music journalism more generally. And I think that's important because like music journalism needs, in order for people to make livings at it, these things need to be sustainable. And Conde Nast has many, many, many issues, like a ton of issues. But in the words of like one article I read, it's like Conde Nast's checks still clear, and Time, which was its like bigger, better competitor in like the 90s and early 2000s, is essentially bankrupt. And that like Conde Nast is still a surviving media company in a space in which many, many other media companies of like similar length and longevity and reputation have faltered and fallen by the wayside. And so, not saying that Conde Nast is good, like look at everything that happened with Bon Appetit, look at what they've done like with selective firing of people in this, all kinds of, like, I'm not pro Conde Nast, but thinking about it as like any journalistic enterprise that manages to continue being in business in these challenging times is interesting. And so like,
I don't think Conde Nast has any fucking clue what they're doing. I think they're fucking treading water. Like this is like, so I actually don't, and like the thing is, I think the fact is that they couldn't sell it. I think they probably would sell it if they could, and they couldn't sell it, or they didn't sell it because it's a bad branding. It's bad on branding, because Conde Nast is for Conde Nast to sell a brand is to show weakness. And so what
why didn't they merge it? Why didn't they merge it with the New Yorker?
It's a different audience.
Is it?
And the New Yorker,
is it?
And the New Yorker already has a music writers.
But like, it's a different audience than G fucking Q.
But also New Yorker is like a legacy brand. Like GQ is like constantly like changing its sort of like branding and style and everything.
Kind of. It's like still a lad. It's a glossy lad mag.
Well, this is what exactly. And this is what I find bizarre about it, and why I find it comes out to be such like a strange,
I don't know. I mean, I guess
like result of like I think it's such a strange like ending to Pitchfork, or like the way is that it's basically folded into a magazine in which like it doesn't necessarily fit and it's like GQ doesn't really have a music section probably, so they're like, oh, it could go in here, right? But that's bizarre. And then the thing is like they can't just sell it because that shows weakness, or maybe they literally can't even sell it, or maybe nobody wants to buy it. They're not willing to just fold it, because that means that they are folding their only music publication, I think they're flailing. I don't think they have any clue what's going on. And I think that actually like the problems with Pitchfork are probably more representation of what the problems in fucking the music industry and also just like general media, the media landscape as it is, in the sense that just it's also decentralized now. That's really like the reason why. Like I don't think people don't. I mean, I still think that there's like a cultural reason for like why we need. I mean, I appreciate some sort of filtering system for new music and cultural reportage, but like I don't think it holds this kind of weight where we're waiting for the latest review and rating of the new Radiohead. Like people just don't give a fuck about that anymore. That's a cultural shift.
Sure. No, and I think that's true. I mean, the question is, how much did people care about it to begin with?
Well, I mean, I think that like, you know, like when it was an independent site in like 2005, it reported that it got like 200,000 readers visits to the site like a day, which is like for an independent site in 2005 about that like doesn't cover anything but like underground independent music. I don't know, seems good. But like it was a different time then, you know. I mean, I think it's even. I mean, if you just think about like we were talking about this, we were talking about like the top 50 or the top 100 lists that were like all over the internet, and they're all so vastly different. And you could go back like 10 years, and it's like everybody basically has a general consensus on like what the top 5, top 10 records are. And now it's just like all over the fucking place because it's you know, as we've talked about on this podcast and you and I have talked about personally, it's just so decentralized at this point. And I just don't know how you can continue to maintain this sort of status as like a publication that holds some sort of knowledge and weight that, you know, but it doesn't have like
what you do see that, and this is why I think the Conde Nast example is really interesting, is because certainly like they were always about, and all of those brands, right, since the 50s, they've got this series, I mean since before that, since the 20s, they've got this series of luxury brands targeted at different audiences. And so for a couple like Vogue, like maybe you can still talk about the whole world of fashion, but like a lot of it is just like you're saying, thinking about the New Yorker, which is like still surviving and thriving to a certain extent, although they did just like cut their Talk of the Town staff, which was one of the big like music reviewing parts of it. The New Yorker has survived because they found a way to monetize an audience that came with that publication, that cared about that publication. So a question with Pitchfork, I mean, there's that infamous quote, which is when they buy Pitchfork, they're like, this helps us round out our portfolio with millennial men aged like 25 to 35, which is...
Yeah, the quote is actually from the chief digital officer at the time was, we bring a very passionate audience of millennial males into our roster, which of course caused all kinds of problems.
Which is like a brutal... Yeah, especially given the real legacy of misogyny at early Pitchfork and the like transformative efforts of a generation of brilliant writers, diverse writers, to like change that and to like make new spaces at the highest end, like the most prominent.
And thus also the irony, yeah, exactly, 100%. And thus also the tragic irony of like the fact that it's getting folded into GQ. It's like, oh, Conde Nast still views you that way, like still views Pitchfork that way.
Yeah, no, which is terrible. But like also like I mean the question is like, why couldn't you? The Pitchfork audience is still like a valuable audience, it would seem to me. And so your point about like you need to cover everything, it's like no, you just
it's not. No, it's not that I need to cover everything. It's that it's like it's rather the opposite. It's impossible to cover everything.
I get that.
And so the only way,
what I'm saying is that it's that as a problem doesn't matter to me, because all you need is an audience of people who continue to care what Pitchfork says, and that's your
it's a niche
and
audience.
That's your audience. And it doesn't strike me that like the millennial audience, male or not, has followed Pitchfork. And it'd be interesting. I mean, who knows? Like, to what extent?
You mean it didn't follow Pitchfork like into the has dropped off precipitously in the last like 5
No, I mean that
years.
was the question. Like, we don't know what their readership is like, and we don't know whether things have really dropped off there. I mean, it would strike me is that Pitchfork still has a tremendous amount of cultural cachet, and like millennials, and some of this might just be like market dynamics at the biggest generational sense, which is that like unlike Gen X or the boomers, as millennials are now hitting their 30s and 40s, they may not be able to comfortably afford like $180 subscription in like a oh, I'm doing that just because like I sometimes like to read it, and it's like a marker of culture in the same way that prior generations did with the New Yorker. But it does strike me that what's crazy about the GQ thing is just like, it strikes me that Pitchfork's audience is still really it still has a lot of cultural cachet, and it strikes me as the kind of loyal audience and loyal readership that like you could transform into a paying audience the way that like that's whole GQ's that's Conde Nast's like whole MO. Like that's all they're doing now is like trying to take dedicated readerships and get money out of them and not try to go mass, but actually go like targeted, specific. And so that's what's like, again, the weird thing about the GQ-ness of it, which is like if there was a fall off of readership as the site like diversified and got better and started covering more different kinds of music, like I don't know if pulling it into GQ is going to make those people come back.
It's also
like it seems like you would drive away everyone who valued what the site has been over the past 5 to 10 years. Like I like bizarrely started receiving GQ in the mail this past year. Like I didn't sign up for it. It's not addressed to anyone who lives in my house. I don't know how to make it stop coming, but like I glanced through it and it's like, it's not a bad publication. It's just like for like people like who really think about themselves as men and who are interested in Hollywood and like high-end leather goods. Like it's a weird, it's not, but it's like, it's not poorly written. And like they do have these like New Yorker style, like, oh, you gave someone like $10,000 to write this 5,000 word piece over a period of 4 months.
Like journalism, do like an ayahuasca trip in like fucking like Peru or something. Yeah, totally. But like, I think to go back to one, just to interrupt real quick, I think it's also interesting to note that like Pitchfork never was. I mean, it did have the Pitchfork Review, but it never really was a month. It never was a monthly publication. It remained mostly like just an online publication, which I don't know for Conde Nast, like what else is just online. I mean, I guess there's been switches. Like, I guess what, like, is it
Teen Vogue?
Yeah, now Teen Vogue. Like, I guess like it's Bon Appetit now, just like videos or whatever. But I mean, it's just like, but like it never had a legacy of like being like a publication. So I think that also might be kind of reveal kind of the way that like Conde Nast people like thought about it, was that if it's already just mainly like an online publication anyways, then we'll just fold it into a more legacy, like a stronger, longer legacy magazine, and then it'll be online and also in print. I don't know. I just don't know. It was always like a little bit of a weird marriage because I always feel like, you know, it does feel like they never really probably valued it in the way that music fans valued it. And they probably never really valued it the way that they would value some of their like legacy titles. And it just makes the whole thing just be like such a strange ending. But I don't.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. Again, back to like that ending, right? Is your take, which is always a validly cynical one, Saxon, which is that this is fundamentally it's uninteresting. It's tragic and kind of tragic comic, but at some level fundamentally uninteresting because it's a company flailing that doesn't know what to do with its brands. That has a handful of legacy brands that have managed to make the transition to the digital environment and that are now the kind of like their lodestars. So Vogue and the New Yorker. The New Yorker makes money.
And like these publications probably financially carry the smaller brands, I assume.
Well, so this is the other thing, is that Conde Nast is owned by a larger media group, Advanced Media, which owns a handful of regional papers, and that's the crazy thing about it, despite like the amount of ink that's been spilled over the decline of newspapers, even if it's a declining business, it's still a business that makes a lot of cash. And so, I mean, doing research for this episode, it's like they own the Staten Island Advance, which is the newspaper of Staten Island, which apparently in the 90s made more money than basically all of the Conde Nast publications, like almost put together. And like was able, the reason that Vogue was able to just do whatever it wanted at any cost was because the Staten Island Advance was paying the bills. And I don't know to what extent that's still true. I mean, Staten Island Advance is still a newspaper. But I do think that like that kind of in support of your point, which is that this was always high-end cultural capital being kind of supported by actual functional businesses, and now it's a handful of functional publications supporting other ones. I mean, they had Bon Appetit, but that clearly blew up in their faces because of incredible like racial insensitivity and diversity issues. And that this is like fundamentally at some level uninteresting because it's a flailing company. It's trying to tighten its budget. It did well 2 years ago. It didn't do that well last year, and it's just slashing things. And like this is like a slow circling around the drain for the whole thing. And that's one story, and it might be right. But for the sake of argument, I think it's also worth thinking about like what they are even trying, in as much as they have a plan, like what it might be. Because I do think that in a funny way, like GQ Pitchfork might be less, like they are very, very different, but they might be less polar opposites than they seem on the surface. And like the reason that is again, glancing through a GQ, you have a lifestyle magazine, right? And it sells things that you should engage with for a certain lifestyle and stories that it thinks based on that vision of a lifestyle that you should people who are interested in that lifestyle will like and care about. And in that mode where, like you're saying, music criticism is no longer necessary in the way it once was to sort through the vast array of music that we have. And it's not necessary on two counts, I guess. On one count, like you just said, because there's too much of it. Like, it's too many different kinds of music. The center cannot hold. There's no reasonable top 50. And so, like, a position of judgment over the whole world of music is fundamentally impossible because you like country and I like Latin trap, and, like, those are just different top 10s. And on the flip side, because we have these algorithms that actually sort what music you like and I will like and send us new music that you like and I will like pretty efficiency. Not perfectly, but pretty efficiently. And so like they're getting it from the top and they're getting it from the bottom. And so like the older vision of like what music criticism is for no longer holds. And that older criticism is like, sorry, the older criticism, that older vision, right? The older vision is like it helps inform you. But that leaves like, so what music criticism for now?
Well, and then also like I'd just like to add also like as we've mentioned last year on one of our pods, it's just like old music more like nobody. I won't say nobody listens to new music. Clearly, people listen to new music, but old music is listened to more.
There's a changed temporality in music discovery, especially through algorithmic like avenues. Yeah, totally. But I
always feel like I'm about a year behind.
Yeah.
I'm like, cool, the year ended. Now I can listen to all the music I missed in 2022.
But I want to like go like I thought that if that vision of what music criticism is for is kind of gone, but we still feel a need, both you and I think the general public. Clearly not the general public. The audience of Pitchfork, right? People who still read Pitchfork.
The audience of Money for Nothing.
Yeah. You beautiful, beautiful freak. Right? Like, if there's still a feeling that music criticism is useful, it does, but the legs of what everyone, or at least what I had previously thought of as like the kind of widely accepted vision for what music criticism does have been knocked out, but the chair is still standing. It seems to me that like then maybe music criticism is doing stuff that we didn't think of it, or it's working in a different way than I had thought it did. And in some ways it's less functional, and it's a little bit more about like, it's about lifestyle. It's like a vision of an ethical consumption of music, almost like in order to enjoy music or engage with music or to signal to other people through your consumption of cultural goods that you care about music in a certain way. You need to be an informed consumer of music, and that engaging with this website allows you to be an informed consumer of music. And from that perspective, maybe it's not that different than GQ, where reading GQ allows you to be an informed consumer of various like male-focused leather goods.
Yeah.
Like, is that wrong?
I mean, I don't agree with it.
Why not?
I think that I don't. Well, first of all, like I think I think that I think it's much more simple than that. I think in 2015, when Conde Nast bought Pitchfork, he said it in the tweet. This whatever chief financial officer, who the fuck it was, like Fred whatever, said it in the tweet. He was like, "We're bringing on an audience of millennial males," which they clearly felt like they were missing, apparently, or whatever. And so like they still think about it that way. And I mean, maybe they have the numbers to back it up. Majority of the readers, maybe still male. I don't know. But they just felt like this is where it goes now. And I think it's more like the fact that it hurts the brand to get rid of it because they don't have a music publication. So they want to maintain some sort of music publication. They probably can't sell it because that also hurts the brand if anybody even wanted to buy it. And I think it's much more simple. It's just like it does bring some modicum of readership. And I wouldn't be surprised if GQ online was actually hurting. And so they're thinking like, well, this will help the numbers for GQ.com. I think it's probably like much more like profit driven than this.
Yeah, but in that GQ,
cool, but also like, and maybe not wrong, but I don't think that that's the motivation behind this change. But it is an interesting subject to consider, that the millennial who, and at the age that the millennial that grew up reading Pitchfork, and at the age that the millennial is now, is someone who would also be interested in nice leather goods and what hair products to fix their receding hairline and what ayahuasca trips in Peru are like. Sure, I'm not going to disagree with that, but I don't think that's behind the motivation. And I also think it's sort of, I mean,
also, you just said like their receding hairline, which means that they're men.
Yeah, no, truly. I mean, gentleman's quarterly, right? Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I know, real gender essentialist over here. But like, also, I think that it's interesting because the conversation around Pitchfork is that music journalism is dying, and then Pitchfork somehow lost relevancy, and somehow like was failing, at least in the eyes of Conde Nast. And like, whether or not that's true or not, it does reflect a sort of change in the way that the music industry has also been operating in the last year, where there have been like a number of layoffs. Spotify's changing its like payment platform. Obviously, like Lucian Grange is like seeing like the percentage of like major artists and getting streams like lessening and all that. So it is this sort of interesting sort of like, there's changes in the music industry, and maybe like a way to sort of like go into the last third of this show is to sort of think about how like not only the role of like music journalism currently, but also like how the role of music journalism in relation to not necessarily maybe Pitchfork's failure, because I mean, I think that that's like, that's in the eyes,
that's corporate politics,
and that's also in the that's corporate politics, exactly. That's in the eyes of like the investors of, you know, whatever Alliance Media, where the fuck it's called, and Conde Nast, and more about like the role of music journalism in relation to the changing landscape, the growth of AI in the music industry. And maybe that's like the way to kind of like maybe to like wrap this all up in a sense, because you might be right on that, what you're saying, and I think it's an interesting point, and it's like why people come to listen to this podcast is for takes like that. But I mean, personally, I think we're just gonna have to leave it there, because I think that like, I think it's just a big, huge, slow corporation that's constantly flailing. And I feel like historically, and if I can just finish, like historically, I feel like this has been like an ongoing thing where like, actually, what's interesting, just maybe to continue on that point a little bit, is that we keep seeing these big corporations, legacy companies, making these moves that are like moving towards like whatever, it's like the latest digital trend. Oh, you got to do video now.
Right.
And now this is like, now it's all, you got to do short form. You got to like have like the videos be like viewable perfectly, rectangularly, like, or whatever the fuck it's called, like on an iPhone, you know, and there's all these moves, and they last like 5 years maybe at most. and then it's on the new
Yeah.
thing, and it's like they're constantly chasing the carrot. And for me, it's like the places that kind of like are still sticking around are places that aren't chasing the fucking carrot.
I just want to like pick up on what you were saying, Saxon, because I think it's a really good point, and maybe what I was trying to think about, right? When we say like, what is music criticism for, and what does it do in the world, is like split it into two parts, because at some level, and I think that this is at least some of the feeling of like almost trauma that has erupted online, is that music journalism is doing two different things and is connected to two different industries and has different levels of meaning and role in those two industries. And like for a while it seemed like those could go together, and now increasingly it doesn't. And so like from a journalism perspective, where the goal is to sell papers and to, or subscriptions, or and ideally ads against both of those, though you know, the most successful of these publications have moved away from that, whether that's the New Yorker or like The Wire, right? Which just, I'm sure there are advertisements in The Wire, but like that's an expensive magazine to subscribe to. I've gone in and out of subscribing into it over various years. And like when I don't subscribe, I'm like, I don't think I can afford to pay $90 for a subscription, you know, $100 for a subscription this year. Plus I've got all my wires still to read from last year. Right, so on one side, and I think that in terms of like music criticism as lifestyle reporting, right? That like this, that in that like it's lifestyle reporting, in that the people who read it want music criticism to be part of their lifestyles, like, and caring about music in a certain avenue, in a certain perspective, is part of their lifestyle. In the way, in some ways, you can almost argue that it's like it's a funny long-term holdover from like the 50s, when everyone believed that they had to have an opinion on Beethoven, and they all had like a series of like classical music records bound up like books on their bookshelves. That there's this like capital R romantic vision that like engaging with art with a capital A in a certain way like enriches and deepens life, and to have a certain kind of lifestyle, like understood as like a relationship to society, a certain level of intellectual activity, blah, 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 blah. Like engagement with music in a music critical mode is a valuable part of that. And like that, I, as someone who deeply loves music and really loves music criticism, like don't want to reduce it to that, but like that's not different fundamentally. And I think that one of the things that like the rise of other media to major forms of cultural conversation, in particular TV, to maybe a slightly lesser extent video games, have like right, where like having deeply felt opinions about those have come to be really culturally important. Like it shows the ways in which music criticism and the life, right, is a lifestyle. And so from that perspective, from journalistic enterprise or media enterprise like Conde Nast, you could see being like, well, it's a lifestyle brand. It's a weird lifestyle brand, and we're not sure that we don't understand. But like, yeah, let's put it in with like our other lifestyle brands, right?
No, and like, don't get me wrong. I think that aspect of it is completely correct. I think it is a lifestyle. It's part of, like, we always, the saying is always, music is communal.
Yeah,
but music is communal, and let me see your record collection, and like, and I mean, you could even see this in, I mean, it's funny because it's so ubiquitous now that maybe people don't even notice it. But I mean, just the growth of like bars that are like listening lounges, or like the growth of just like bars that have nice cocktails, they have succulents. It's mostly white and has a lot of mirrors. And there's a guy, the bartender has to flip the record every 45 minutes. I mean, like, just the growth of that, like 10 years ago used to be like unusual. And now it's like almost feels like a common style of bar.
25 minutes, okay, Saxon. You got to flip the record every 25 minutes. Come on, Mike.
No, but usually he's already in the middle. The funny thing is what happens here at these places is that usually you have like, he needs to actually make the fucking drinks. And so you just sit in silence for 20 minutes waiting for them to flip the record. But but like, Yeah, it's completely a lifestyle now, and but it's particularly, it's like in the growth of vinyl and like vinyl, and the not growth, I guess the return
The
to
resurgence of
the
vinyl,
resurgence, and even now even fucking cassettes and like all this shit. Of course, totally, it's a way to define yourself, of course. But
so like that's on one side, right? And then on the other side, I think, is this sense that also I think maybe should be interrogated, and maybe we can wrap things up by talking about it from this perspective, which is that music criticism does something fundamentally important for the music industry.
right,
And that's actually really interesting to me because that relationship is not built into the economic models behind music criticism that much, right?
Right.
Like, sure, record labels used to run a lot of ads, and they're clearly they're touch on each other, but like it seems to me like a lot of the discussion about Pitchfork and a lot of the kind of bemoaning of its potential loss and its folding are like, what's going to happen in the music industry? Who are bands going to pitch? How are like certain kinds of bands going to get heard? And this sense that like music criticism is doing something vital for the health of the music industry. And that's, I think, really interesting because that's probably true. Certainly, I think it's important for the health of certain sectors of the music industry. Like there's the kind of the Bandcamp to Pitchfork pipeline of like small tours buying, right? Like I don't think Pitchfork is moving. I mean, clearly Pitchfork was able to move the needle at its height on a handful of artists who were breaking from one category to another. So like Pitchfork championing like
this is easy. Arcade Fire, Animal Collective, like
no, but that's no. I'm saying like, but those were like
they also did do that though. They did,
and they
they did
absolutely, and they helped break those artists. But also I'm just thinking about in terms of like large scale pop records, like even at its biggest, like Arcade Fire wasn't moving massive numbers of records.
Yeah. But them covering like the Taylor Swift album that Jack Antonoff produced.
Yeah, no, but I'm saying like I feel like they helped break like Wayne when when Wayne was like not break Wayne in terms of pop radio, but break Wayne into a new audience of like what like they covering like the Drought 3 and being like right, like there's like like certain kinds of moves like where actually then like the cultural cachet would bring in new audiences. But for me, so like it can but for the most part, pop stars aren't relying on Pitchfork.
No,
Taylor Swift doesn't care. Beyonce doesn't care. Drake doesn't care.
Nor do the labels.
But at a lower level, it does seem really important. At a lower level where like a little bit of press can help you get a different set of touring circuits. Like it does seem like these kind of channels and these social networks are really, really important.
Well, which makes me think though, and maybe this is where you're going, but it makes me think that like maybe one of the reasons for the lessening sort of importance of a place like Pitchfork or music criticism to like these labels is the rise of streaming, in the sense that it just becomes more important to be on a playlist or be like sort of like gaming the algorithms than to like get a fucking popular review on Pitchfork as an up-and-coming band.
Yeah, I think that can definitely be true. I mean, I also just think that the labels are running tighter. Many things are running tighter. Certainly, like, but also like you were just saying, like there's a lot of black boxing here. I mean, I think you're assuming a declining relevancy of Pitchfork when actually we don't know if that is why these cuts happen. We just know that Conde Nast had a bad 2023 and did a bunch of cuts across the board, right? Cutting all kinds of stuff. And that's, I think that like that's like keeping that in our minds, but also on the journalism side of the equation. Because what's interesting to me though is that actually thinking about music journalism as something that emerges out of something that's integrally tied to the music industry is not how it's been set up economically, but if we think about it as actually vital to a sector of the music industry, I wonder if it maybe opens, and this is like the rare moment where like pushing back against doom and gloom a little bit, maybe a rare moment where actually like maybe there are many reasons why the critical apparatus around music was centered in journalism. Some of it was like they were the only ones who could print papers for most of the 20th century. Like you needed a press. Some of it's like you relied on record company money for advertisements and stuff, but like that the people who wanted to write about stuff tended to go. I mean, some of them ended up, I guess, like as A&R people and labels, but like people who stuck in journalism, like quad journalism, like ended up ideally writing for bigger and bigger publications, and like that was the industry they were located in. But it doesn't seem like that's necessarily the only way it could be, and it doesn't seem like if in fact the music scene is gonna be, if it's true that the music scene is gonna be infinitely weaker or much weaker or significantly weaker without something like Pitchfork or without a vibrant music press, and it's true that there's still a market for this, maybe the trick is like trying to figure out a way that you could locate that in the music industry instead of in journalism.
Okay.
Like, okay, so that sounds weird, but like thinking about, I don't know, like if all these indie bands need a music, if all these indie bands need a place where they get written about, like you could imagine like a band owned.
No,
because you need what you need.
That's not the no. This is what's gonna happen. No, this is gonna happen. Is that like, no, this is gonna happen. No. There's gonna be an influx of too many fucking Substacks. All right, because everybody's losing their.
Well,
job.
That is true.
And so what's cool about that is that like, and you're already beginning to see that is because there are too many fucking Substacks already, and everybody's losing their job. You're seeing essentially a repeat of how places like Stereo Gum, Consequence of Sound, and Pitchfork formed, where you're getting a bunch of writers who are passionate about this, and they're getting together, and they're like, what if we combined all our efforts? I mean, the Tone Glow newsletter is like a perfect example. If you don't subscribe, it's pretty awesome. But yeah, like, and I think you're going to see more of that, where you're going to see these sort of, which is really what you saw not only like back in the blog days, but or how it developed out of the blogs, but also like what you kind of also saw, like I think in the 2010s with, I'm blanking on the name, but I remember there used to be this one music website that also like linked to like 30 other music blogs. And it like, I think you're going to kind of return to that, where essentially like it's going to be more of a collective of many writers who are finding themselves unemployed, but there's still an audience, there's still a market for this, and they're going to kind of come together. And maybe the most ideal part about this is they start their own fucking Pitchfork, and in 10 years when they have 200,000 readers, fingers crossed, they don't fucking sell to fucking Conde Nast.
Well, but the problem...
No, that's more idea. How does that work economically? Who fucking knows, right? But I'm just saying, like, are they able to make a living?
The problem with that...
But I think that's probably what we're going to see in the near future.
The problem with that is what I would call like the 25 to 30 problem, which is that it's possible to do some unsustainable stuff when you're 25 and your cohort is 25 and everyone is 25 in the whole world, and there's literally no one who's older than 27 alive. But like eventually that's no longer true, and people like want to have more stability in their lives. And so like I do feel like that's what institutions like Pitchfork allowed to happen, is that people have like a paycheck that runs, and that they're not as worried about it, and they have more security. And
no, completely. And like, I mean, and that's the ideal end goal of I'm sure already these sort of loose alliances of Substacks and blogs.
But I guess what I'm saying is, and again, this might be a truly stupid idea, and I think Saxon, you think it is, but like the record industry, maybe not. No. Hold on. If like David Israelite and the songwriters, or like if Merlin and the independent distributors, if you actually feel like you've been coasting for the last 20 years on there being a publication like Pitchfork that a different industry was supporting, and maybe the point is that music journalism shouldn't be considered something that's like a part of journalism where like the goal is eventually to be the pop critic on the New York Times. Maybe music journalism is something more inside of the music industry, which to a certain extent we all know it is anyway, right? Like those incestuous connections that get like bands placed and stuff that everyone's always been complaining about, like suggest that it always was that way. It just, the music industry wasn't ever willing to pick up the check. And like maybe there's an option where it's like you either need to pick up some of the check or there won't be this. And maybe the big record labels are like totally fine, but like for smaller labels that might be actually a problem.
I mean, that might work for Gen Z and younger, and I can't speak for that generation. I think that the readers of Pitchfork, and once again, I'm making a generalization, maybe I'm wrong, but you know, I think millennials are defined by this obsession around authenticity.
Yeah.
And independence. And the thing is that like they just won't buy into that.
But they won't buy in anything. They won't subscribe.
They do buy into it to a certain extent, in the sense that like plenty of them attended Red Bull Music Academy events, because even though it's being sponsored by Red Bull, it did maintain a certain sense of authenticity, because the events that were put on by Adam Shore and company were like so clearly not trying to get you to buy a Red Bull. You know, like a huge queer rave in a warehouse where like literally there was like a neon sign that was just like a huge penis shooting cum like behind the bar, and you got free Red Bull, but like that's it. I mean, there was nothing trying to show, and it was like badass DJs and dudes dancing like in leather in like cages. I mean, like
no,
yeah,
it was
insane.
Not that Red Bull adjacent, some of those events.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so the thing is like, okay, yes, like at some level, I just think millennials are super obsessed with this sort of this idea of authenticity and like a willingness to participate with like brand labeled stuff only goes so far. And it can't be as obvious. Now that might be different with Gen Z, and that might be different for the next generations, and maybe what you're saying would work. But I think that like it would have to thread a needle that is, let's just say the major labels, I think, have not shown the willingness or ability to do that yet.
No, you're right. And it's also the thinking about millennials and their relationship to the internet and Substacks is so much of the modern internet. Some of it's just like social pressures, you know? Like, by which I mean Pitchfork is free, Stereogum is free,
yeah,
Much of the Quietest is free, and like that's how websites were understood to function. And so because they were free and backed by advertisements, and of course, as we've been discussing, like the advertisements start to go away and it's a crisis. And one of the things that's interesting about Substacks are that like people subscribe to them, like partially because it's just a different, and this is like very human, it's a different social form, right? And the expectation is that you get some stuff, but if you want the whole thing, you subscribe to you subscribe. And so there is a question where some of this, like in terms of that vision of what you're going to get is like the kind of blog to consortium again, is whether you do it, but this time everyone has to pay. And you say, if you want to read music journalism, you have to pay for it. And I do wonder, like, if Pitchfork...
Very market-driven, like, approach, but I mean,
but, like, that's what makes things sustainable. And, like, I do wonder, like, if Pitchfork had been a magazine, I mean, it wouldn't have worked, right? Like, they tried to do the Pitchfork review for a second, and, like, but that if there was that monetization all the way through, right? The space between Pitchfork and the New Yorker collapses a little bit. Because I would love to see, like, the Venn diagram of under 45 subscribers to the New Yorker and readers of Pitchfork. And I bet you that there's a lot of overlap. Not 100%, but a lot. Not older, but clearly. But, like, and so I just wonder, like, and the big difference there is that everyone always knows that to read the New Yorker, you have to get a subscription, a digital subscription or a print subscription, and it's expensive. But to be a person who reads the New Yorker, you subscribe to it. And that just wasn't true with Pitchfork. And I do wonder, again, thinking about the Substack theory, which I think is clearly like what's going to happen to, at least in the immediate present, like if for the new generation, to be an informed music person, once again, you need to either, get all your stuff from TikTok, or but if you want to read music criticism, you pay for it. Maybe that's a slightly more sustainable model. I mean, who knows, but
yeah, and I think that maybe that kind of answers our question around whether or not Pitchfork was successful at Conde Nast, is that's also another option that Conde Nast could have decided, was that we're going to make it, you have to pay to read the reviews. And clearly they felt through whatever market research they've done that wasn't going to happen. Okay, once again, I could be wrong, but like people weren't going to pay for it, which is an unfortunate way to kind of end the show. But I think that's kind of the reality that maybe is facing music journalism and music journalists, which is the question of, will people pay for it? Because right now that seems to be the only model in which it's a sustainable career. And yeah, I guess we'll have to just wait and see when we get the music Substack blogging alliance.
The music, it's the music writers workers alliance, like.
Yeah, right. Yeah, former employees of Pitchfork. Okay, that was a bit freewheeling, but we're gonna tie a bow on it. Obviously,
a lot of thoughts,
RIP
a lot of feelings.
Pitchfork, a lot of feelings. Yeah, I mean,
subscribe to Quietus.
The one thing, yeah. God, man, the Quietus. Amazing how long they've just been able to maintain. Yeah, and introducing me to this new neo-Irish folk shit. That's pretty dope. Anyways, okay. Rate and review us, please. We don't make any money. Music by Bird Language. See you soon. Bye.